It were another rainy Saturday in our small village of Port Galia, and the storm clouds that came over the sea seemed darker and more ominous than ever, as they cast their shadows down onto the usually blue, but now apparently grey ocean. It had been raining for almost 2 weeks straight, and all of the townsfolk were, safe to say, jolly fed up with the constant downpour. My husband Rodney was especially frustrated with the weather, and grumpier than normal, as he'd come home every day from his fishing trips, soaked to the skin, with boots filled with rainwater. Blasted rain, he'd say, each time he entered the front door. I'd try my best not to laugh, but our two nephews found it much harder not to crack a smile as he tipped his boots upside down and a river of water would pour out onto the floor. Yes, indeed, it had been a soggy couple of weeks in Port Galia. But it was on that day, when the weather seemed even more miserable than before, that something happened to my dear Rodney that myself and Rodney have never forgotten. It all began when he was about to leave for another fishing trip out in his sulky salmon. That's the name of his boat, by the way. He was just finishing downing his second mug of coffee and fourth piece of toast with marmalade late that morning, when our older nephew Lester piped up about the storm coming in.
It looks to be an awful one, Uncle,
he said, his mouth still half full of breakfast.
It's rolling in faster than a sedan with no brakes. You're sure it's safe to go out with such a front coming over?
My husband set his newspaper down on the table and looked at his nephew with disdain.
Safe? Of course it's safe. The old sulky salmon and I have been weathering storms like this since before you was sucking dummies. I don't intend on giving in to a bit of rain.
Oh, but it's supposed to be more than rain, Uncle.
William, the younger nephew of the pair, chimed in, joining the conversation as he sat down at the table.
You're late. I've almost finished and your tea's gone cold.
Yes, sorry, Uncle. Now, as I was saying...
Why?
Why what, Uncle?
Are you late?
Oh, I'd rather not say if you don't mind.
Well, I do.
Well, in that case, I dropped my toothbrush in the toilet.
You did what? That's hilarious. I hope you cleaned it.
I couldn't. What did you want me to do, reach in and take it out?
Yes.
My husband said flatly.
Otherwise, when someone flushes it, it'll block the loo and cause an almighty mess, and you already flushed it, didn't you?
Yes, Uncle. I'm very sorry.
Ah, great. As if I didn't already have enough water to deal with. I'll sort it when I get back from fishing.
But what do we do until you get back?
Well, I don't know. How about hold it?
My now quite ticked off husband said as he got up from the table and brushed himself down.
I'll be back for lunch. You can wait until then. I'll see you all later.
But the storm, Uncle.
I told you it would be fine. Now I'll see you later.
Are you sure you couldn't wait until this afternoon to go fishing, love? Surely it wouldn't make any difference if you let it calm down a little before you sail into it. Couldn't you wait, dear?
No, I'll have to fix the loo when I get back. My mind's made up. Now for the last time, I'll see you later.
The door shut with a slam, and I watched out the window as my husband stomped off down the path towards the ocean. I could already see its curling and foaming white frills getting larger as the waves were pushed back into the sea. The wind was against it, and that meant my husband's boat would be pushed out with it. Lester and William were concerned for him, and truthfully, so was I. But when my dear husband's mind's made up, it's made up, and there ain't any unmaking it. So the morning continued on, and soon the dishes were cleaned and put away. Lester was off to work extra hours at Harry Fenchurch's butcher's, and William and I decided to brave the rain to go to Mr. and Mrs. Davis' corner shop to pick up some bits and pieces I needed for the week to come. Heading out the door, We were hit by the wind and rain that pelted the town without relent. It was just as Lester had said, an awful one, and we ran like the dickens through it to get to the shop, up the winding street that went through the middle of Port Galia. Not a soul was out and about except Officer Scott Thompson on that bike, patrolling the area to make sure everyone was safe. He stopped with a slide of his wheels and a ring of his bell and looked at us both in disbelief.
Hello. What are you two doing out in this weather? You both all right?
A bit bedraggled, but quite all right. It's Rodney I'm worried about.
Oh, don't tell me he went out fishing in this weather. He'd be silly to try and catch fish out there. It's not safe.
That's what we tried to tell him, but he wouldn't listen. My uncle can be quite stubborn that way.
Oh, you've got that right. I'll tell you what, I hope for his sake this storm dies down soon, or he could be in for a hefty bag of trouble. Where are you two headed anyway?
Just to the corner shop. Got some staples to pick up, that's all.
Oh, all right then. Keep safe. Cheerio.
Well, for a police officer, I didn't find what he said reassuring. In fact, it made me even more nervous over my husband being out on the sea in the storm. He was a very experienced fisherman, no doubt, but even the most experienced can be caught out by the weather. Fretting over it wasn't going to change the fact that he was out there, though. And so William and I walked into the Davis shop to escape the rain and the wind in the street. When we walked in, Mr. Davis was standing tall behind the counter, and he looked at us with a laugh.
Well, I'll be,
he exclaimed, observing our windswept and wet appearance.
You two look like you've been swimming. Though I wouldn't recommend it, mind you. Not with the way the weather is. The water's bound to be kicking up swells.
I know. Rodney's out there.
Goodness. That's a tad foolish, don't you think?
Yes, but my uncle wouldn't listen to us when we told him not to go. He's fixed on making a catch. Even with the weather like it is, he has his mind set on going out there, come rain or shine.
My. Well, I do hope he's all right.
Patrick replied, his expression a little worried now.
I've heard this storm's supposed to be the worst this winter. A real wicked one. When's he supposed to be back?
Lunchtime. But with that wind picking up like it is, and the rain driving down with it, I don't fancy him being out there any longer.
I don't blame you. But what can you do?
I don't know. Just wait, I suppose. Well, we better brave the weather again and head back. Seems to be getting worse.
Aren't you forgetting something?
Oh, I replied, realising my error. I'm sorry, Patrick. Yes, let me get my list. I told Mr. Davis what I needed, and he placed it all in a brown bag for me and handed it to William. I was beginning to feel very concerned indeed about my Rodney in that thick and driving rain and churning waves, and so instead of going straight home, William dropped off the groceries inside the door and grabbed our umbrella, and we headed down to the port to see if we could spot him. I looked out at the stirring sea, but there was not a sign of Rodney or his sulky salmon anywhere. William thought perhaps he'd sailed past the cliffs around the cove like he usually did, and so we walked a little ways further along the shore to get clear of the large rock formation blocking the view of the ocean where he might be. That rain wasn't letting up though, and that made visibility quite poor for even the sharpest eyes. Yet somehow William was able to spot a greyish looking mass on the water in the distance, and without doubt I knew it was Rodney's boat. It was very hard to see as it was awfully far out, but I called out as loud as I could in hopes that he would hear me. Rodney! Rodney! You all right out there?
He won't hear you, Auntie. Not over this wind and rain. He's being driven out further and further because the tide's going out. He'll have no choice but to go with it and wait for the storm to subside. I'm sorry, Auntie, but we're just going to have to wait until the storm passes.
And so, rather reluctantly, we did. We went home and waited and prayed. Lester came back that evening, and he waited and prayed too. It were pitch black by that time, and the storm hadn't seemed to have stopped for one moment. My dear Rodney had been out there all day, and I couldn't help but worry as I looked at the kitchen window being battered by the rain. It hadn't let up, and I could only imagine my poor husband out on his boat, getting soaked to the skin and tossed by the waves. Lester, William and I sat round the small dining table in our kitchen with mugs of hot chocolate and hoped that the door would open and our soggy Rodney would come in. But 2 hours passed and he still wasn't there, and soon the boys' eyelids were closed and mine were beginning to flutter as well. Before I knew it, I had been woken from a dream about Rodney by the grandfather clock that stood proud against the wall. It rang out a chime and told that it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and I gently shook my sleeping nephews awake.
Oh dear, I must have fallen asleep. What's the time?
It's 1 o'clock.
Crikey, we must have been dozing for nearly 4 hours. I'm sorry, Auntie. We should have stayed up with you.
That's all right, dear. I fell asleep as well. Oh, I had an awful dream about Rodney in the storm.
Speaking of the storm...
William piped up, pointing at the window.
Look, it's not raining anymore.
He jumped out his chair and opened the front door to get a better look. And he was right. The storm had passed completely, leaving a trail of deep puddles and windswept trees. We didn't know for how long it had been gone. We were all jolly glad to see that it was, no matter whether it be 2 minutes or 2 hours. William shut the door and looked at us both with a smile.
It will all be all right now, Auntie. Uncle Rodney will be back home in no time. Just you wait and see.
And at that moment, the door flew open again and we all jumped out our skin. And even soggier and wetter Rodney was standing there, his fisherman's coat and hat absolutely dripping with rain and seawater combined. He looked at us all, and I must admit I expected him to be grumpier than normal. But instead, an unusually large smile crept across his round face, and his eyes seemed to gleam at the sight of his wife and nephews.
Oh, it's been one long night,
he said in a most relieved manner.
For us too, Uncle.
William exclaimed, forgetting himself and hugging his soggy ankle.
Are you quite all right? We saw your boat from the shore, but there was nothing we could do. The tide was pulling you out, and the storm was being no help either. I'm so glad you're all right.
Oh, so am I, Willie. So am I.
Thank the good Lord you're okay. I've been fretting all day about you. Though I must admit, darling, I thought you'd be a tad, well, grumpier after all that time on the water.
Oh, Patsy, love, I'm far too tired and wet to be grumpy. I've never faced a storm like that in my life.
It was supposed to be the worst storm all winter, according to Mr. Davies. And Mr. Fenchurch at the butcher's said it's been such a terrific storm sweeping across the country that it stopped his meat shipment from getting to him.
Oh, I'm not surprised, Lester. It was certainly quite the storm. Oh, you should have seen it out there. Waves crashing at my back and pushing me further and further into the deep blue. I thought I may never get back. The cold wind started whipping my cheeks and the wind started to fill the boat, and I tell you, my life flashed before my eyes, and it was very long and rather boring, actually.
I'm just happy you're all right, love. We were awake for hours staying up for you, but I must admit we fell asleep while the storm was going on. What time did it stop?
Not soon enough. Miss Sulky Salmon's been more battered than a chip shop fish cake, and it took all she and I had to get her back on shore in the darkness. I could hardly believe it when we finally got docked on the port again.
Well, you can tell us more about it when we get you dry.
Oh, no,
he said, with a long and tired yawn.
As soon as I'm out of these sea-sodden clothes, I'll be asleep in salmon before you can say seared shrimp.
But you can't, Uncle.
And why not?
Rodney replied, his grumpy side resurfacing.
Well, you see, the toilet's still broken and I'm sort of busting a little.
William?
Yes, Uncle?
When I came in, I felt unusually happy to see you all. Don't make me change me mood, alright? I'll fix it in the morning.
But what should I do until then?
Like I said to you earlier, lad. Hold it!
And so you see why that weekend was one we have never ever forgotten. A broken loo and a storm like we'd never seen before. But perhaps by far the most surprising thing was to see my dear Rodney come home with a smile on his face, and not the grumpy expression I was so used to. You'll also be pleased to know that William was able to relieve himself the next morning after my exhausted fisherman had a long, long lie-in.
In this episode of Port Galia, we saw Rodney Cole make a foolish decision to go fishing despite being warned of an incoming storm. And as you saw today, the results were not only a frightening experience on the water, but a lot of time spent worrying from his family and friends. You see, when we are warned about something and given advice not to do it, and we do it anyway, quite often it can cause nothing but trouble for us. And sometimes, others also. We see this in the Bible when it tells us in Proverbs 12:15 that the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. This means that it is foolish to refuse to hear others' advice, and we see this demonstrated very plainly in the story you've heard today. If Rodney had listened to his family's warnings, he wouldn't have been pushed far out into the sea and left to fend for himself in the waves. So if you're going to do something, and someone gives you advice not to do it, listen to them first, because it could be that it saves you from a mess you don't want to be in.